And now I would like to invite our guest, Matthew Barber, who is today with his people, I can say. Matthew, the floor is yours. Yeah.
Matthew. Thank you for welcoming me here today. It's really a great honor to speak on this lawn in front of the German Parliament. It's a greater honor to be here with you, in fact. Today, I want to speak about a great injustice, but probably not the one you're thinking of. When I speak in this context and I mention a great injustice, you're probably thinking about the genocide. Well, yes, a little bit we'll talk about the genocide. But I want to speak about another injustice. I want to speak about the fact that Yazidis are still living in camps today, 10 years after the genocide took place. How is that possible? How is that justifiable? It is not. It is wrong, and it represents the failure of the world to properly intervene and address this situation. How is it that Yazidis are still in camps today when the north side of Shingal Mountain was liberated the same year the genocide began in 2014? How is it that Yazidis are still in camps today when farmers began returning in early 2015? Not only are Yazidis in camps, but 10 years after the genocide began, today, there is still no functioning administration in Shingal. There is no Kaimakam. There is no stability and resolution to the political disaster that followed the Yazidi genocide. And I don't see any governments seriously working to fix that situation. Now, when there is a genocide and the world recognizes it as a genocide, we expect a real effort, not only to bring recovery, but to address the root causes and establish a framework so that that genocide will never occur again. And that's not happening, and it hasn't happened for a decade. And on that level, Western countries are culpable in the extending, in the drawing out of this genocide. Most Western governments believe that they have helped. They believe they've done right by the Yazidis. I don't see it that way. And today I'm going to go into detail to discuss why. The primary problem in the approach of the Western governments and the UN is that they keep trying to force the Yazidis into the arms of their abuser. Now, before we talk about how the West does this, we first need to talk about the abuser and the abuse. So to begin with, we need to exercise honesty and directness in naming the abuser. The abuser is the KDP, the Kurdistan Democratic Party. This is the dominant party of the Kurdistan Regional Government. It dominates the KRG. It is a family party run by a family business, the Barzani family. You need to understand the history of abusiveness employed by the KDP against the Yazidi people, because it goes back before the genocide began. In 2003, when Saddam Hussein fell, the KDP unilaterally entered Shingal without making an agreement with the local people. They brought certain security forces. They established a network and system of party offices, and they basically told the local people, well, we're in charge now, and your region is going to become part of Kurdistan. Now, when this happened, a lot of people were happy because they thought, well, this new system of authority will be a lot better than the system that existed under Saddam. Other people were perplexed. They said, well, we didn't ask you to come in, and maybe we should work on becoming in charge of our own area. Why should an external political party come and establish physical force on the ground here? Over time, even those who had been happy in the beginning became disenfranchised by how closely the system of power that the KDP created, how closely it mirrored the Ba'ath system. So I'm going to give you examples of how this worked. The KDP was able to fully take control of the economy in Shingal and run it by gaining control over the hiring for the two most important sectors for jobs in Shingal. They took control of the education sector and they took control of the healthcare sector. And what they did, they made it so that if you want to get a job working in a hospital in healthcare or working in a school as a teacher, you would have to bring a piece of paper that proved that you were a member in this party. Now, you would do that by visiting an office called a Lijna. The KDP established Lijnas, which are ostensibly party offices, throughout Shingal. But in reality, the Lijnas doubled as a kind of military office, as a kind of institution of force that involved not only certain amounts of Peshmerga forces, but also Asaish, or secret police forces. So if you wanted to get hired, you would have to go visit the Lejna, sign up and join the KDP, and then bring a paper showing that you belonged to the KDP when you applied for your job. Does that sound like democracy? For Yazidis who traveled from Shingal to the Kurdistan region to get jobs, working in restaurants, working in hotels, working as base laborers in a variety of industries and areas, they also had to go secure a document proving they had joined the PDK, the KDP, and show that at the primary checkpoint. Otherwise, they wouldn't be allowed into the Kurdistan region to do this work. Another reason that the KDP wanted to control Shingal was that they could use the Shingal area as basically a free voter pool in elections. And they did this by forcing people to vote the way that they wanted them to. There has never been a free election in Shingal. Every election has been fraudulent. I have detailed research material that I have gathered about the methods used by the KDP to force local people to vote the way they wanted them to. Or people who didn't know how to read and write, who would come to vote, and the people working in the polling station would select the candidate that they wanted them to vote for. The person might think they were voting for someone else, but they were voting for the KDP. Now, local Yazidi people in Shingal who decided they didn't want to participate in this political system, they wanted to engage directly with Baghdad, which was the new government of this newly transformed country. People who formed parties, people who wanted to work directly with the parliament in Baghdad. These people were targeted with terror, with violence, and with torture by KDP secret police called Asaish. Many of these people were arrested. Many of them were beaten. I have detailed accounts from people, from journalists who were almost tortured to death because they wrote something or posted something that was critical of these tactics. So there were never any basic democratic norms in Shingal. The people of Shingal were treated as third-class citizens, and they were completely controlled by the KDP. There was very little media attention ever allowed into the area to see what was going on, and anyone who publicly dared to speak about it, they were targeted with violence and fear. And the lejnes often doubled as secret police interrogation centers. So the Asaish, if they arrested a Yazidi dissident, they would often take them to a lejne, the same place that's supposed to just be a party office, a place you go to join a political party, and they would beat and torture people and question people inside this place. So this mirrored the Ba'ath system, where you have a series of offices tied to a political party, but they're in control of everything. That's how Shingal was before the genocide. That's how Shingal was for more than a decade. And the purpose of the Asaish, of the secret police, was really not to provide security. It was to enforce political compliance with this system. And Shingal was not the only place of Yazidi habitation that suffered after the transformation of power when Saddam was deposed. The Sheikhan area near Duhok, in the Nineveh plain, it also underwent a process of Kurdification. When Saddam fell, Sheikhan was a Yazidi majority area. This had never been changed by Saddam. But today, Sheikhan is a Muslim majority area because of an intentional project of demographic shifting that the KDP pursued after 2003 in Sheikhan. And this is really dangerous when we're talking about a religious minority that used to inhabit vast areas of the northern Middle East centuries ago, and today it only has a few small enclaves where it remains the majority. If a government like the KRG, controlled primarily by the KDP, pursues a project of demographic change to convert minority areas into Muslim majority areas, the way has happened to Sheikhan, it endangers the future survival of the Yazidis, and it erodes the small homelands that remain their heritage today. Now, the rhetoric during this period that I'm describing, this decade between Saddam and the genocide, the rhetoric coming from the KDP, coming from the government, it always affirmed the Yazidis as an indispensable part of the Kurdish nation. The Yazidis are the original Kurds. They're the true Kurds. They're the example of what we really are. This was rhetoric to attempt to legitimize KDP claims to areas like Shingal that were outside of the Kurdistan region. These were areas that had never belonged to Kurdistan, but they wanted to annex them. How did they do that? Through a project of imposing a certain political and nationalist identity onto the people in those areas. People I have interviewed in my research have described how one night in Shingal, they awoke to loud gunfire, celebratory gunfire. What's going on? The neighbors are shooting guns in the air. The neighbors were staunch members of the KDP, and they were celebrating. Why are they celebrating? Masoud Barzani has declared Shingal the capital of Kurdistan. Wow, how exciting. Shingal is now the capital of Kurdistan. Apparently they're going to move the capital of Kurdistan from Erbil to Shingal, because Masoud Barzani said Shingal is the capital. So people were celebrating in the middle of the night, shooting their guns. Well, if Shingal was the capital of Kurdistan, then you would expect when a Salafi jihadist force with murderous intent comes to annihilate the Yazidi people and enslave them, I mean, it would be only natural for the Kurdistan region, for the KDP, to defend those people, correct? The people they said were their capital. That's what should have happened. They would have helped. That's not what happened on August 3rd, 2014. That's not what happened when this genocide began. Now, it's important to mention that there was foreknowledge of the threat, of the danger, because Daesh, ISIS, invaded Mosul from Syria almost 2 months before the Yazidi genocide began. And during those 2 months, ISIS gradually surrounded Shingal Mountain. There was Daesh to the west, inside Syria. Inside Iraq, ISIS consolidated control over Arab areas south and east of Shingal. They conquered Tel Afar through a gradual process. the people of Tal Afar evacuated through Shingal. There were sporadic attacks against Yazidi communities in Shingal from the Arab areas around Shingal. ISIS controlled areas around to the north of Shingal. There were some attacks by ISIS jihadists on some communities north of the mountain. And inside Syria, all the way north to Tel Hamis, there was an ISIS presence. So all the world watching, this wasn't in the news, but certainly the intelligence agencies of Western governments, they were watching, they knew, and absolutely people inside the country knew. And the KDP certainly knew. The Peshmerga knew because there were Peshmerga there inside Shingal. Now, during this period, they started a policy of preventing Yazidis from leaving Shingal. There were people who were not comfortable with this environment at all, and for good reason, and they tried to take their families and migrate into the Kurdistan region. And they were turned back at the primary checkpoint at Suhaila that controls all access between Shingal and Dahuk. They were told, go home. Nobody's allowed to leave Shingal. This was happening for at least a month before the genocide. And then in the days just prior to the genocide, including on August 2nd, when everybody became aware that there's serious danger, because Arabs in Arab communities were calling Yazidis and saying, we know something's about to happen, you're about to be attacked. Daesh is mobilizing here, and local people, our neighbors, are mobilizing. People knew they weren't safe, so they tried to start evacuating. They packed their belongings into their cars, put the children in the cars, started to drive out of the villages, out of the Mujamma'at, on the south side of the mountain, like Tel Azer and Gerzerek and Sib Sheikh Khadr. And when they got to the checkpoints, the KDP Asaish checkpoints that guard the entrances of their own villages, they were told they weren't allowed to leave their own villages. They were made prisoners inside a death trap, inside their own towns. They were told, you should feel ashamed for trying to flee while we are here protecting you. We're keeping you safe, and you're trying to run away. That's cowardly. Go back to your house. And then what happened? In the early hours of the morning, before ISIS reached the mountain and engaged with Peshmerga forces, the Peshmerga and the Asaish and the KDP political apparatus, they all collectively withdrew in an organized and planned fashion. And that abandoned the people to slaughter. So you understand what I mean when I refer to an abuser. We know that ISIS was the primary culprit in this genocide and that they bear the most guilt for the bloodshed. But the KDP is actor number 2. They allowed this genocide to take place. And that makes them co-perpetrators in this genocide. And this is a very important term to think about. They might not have been the primary perpetrator, but they are co-perpetrators, and they share in the guilt for this genocide. Now, after this happened, the KDP, in its engagement with Western governments and in its talks with US officials and in the media, it began to propagate 3 lies about the nature of the genocide. It said, number 1, we didn't have enough weapons to defend the Yazidis, and that's why we weren't able to save their lives. Number 2, it was a surprise attack from Daesh. We didn't know it was coming. They just showed up and surprised us. Number 3, they said, well, we tried to defend, but our lines broke. Our lines broke and we had to retreat. Well, all of these are lies because, to begin with, Yazidis on their own, without any support from troops, successfully defended certain areas for temporary periods of time. The men in Sib Sheikh Khadr, they almost succeeded in repelling the ISIS attack completely, but they ran out of ammunition. Imagine what they could have accomplished had the Peshmerga stayed and supported them. I also interviewed, back in 2015 and 16, I interviewed farmers in little enclaves up in the foothills of the mountain that were sometimes able to keep ISIS out of their communities just with hunting rifles. Several farmers with some old hunting rifles. because they had the high ground advantage and the rocky outcroppings that provided cover. And ISIS couldn't really penetrate those areas. And they had no military supporting them. Now imagine if the Peshmerga had stayed just a few hours and provided cover as people evacuated to the mountain. They would have saved thousands of lives, and they would have saved thousands of women and girls from enslavement. But they didn't. They withdrew before civilians had a chance to withdraw, before civilians had a chance to wake up in their beds. They withdrew without warning local people. Now, you would expect that after something like this happens, the international community would pursue accountability against the KDP for something like that, right? Instead, it gets worse. Once the Yazidis were inside the camps in Duhok, and once parts of Shingal were liberated and became viable for return and reconstruction, and farmers began returning to harvest crops that in some cases were still standing in their fields. And even in 2015, I went out and met men who were rebuilding their homes or building new homes. Not even a full year into the genocide, and they were building new homes. People were ready for recovery. No one wants to live in conditions of genocide indefinitely, and no one wants to live in a camp for a decade and raise their children in a camp, and children growing up and spending their entire adolescence and teen years in camps. Nobody wants that, right? They're ready to go home. They're a dignified people. They're ready to work hard. So what happened? Did the KDP encourage that and provide the support that the international community was always pledging for the Yazidi community? And the way that when the international officials from the German government, American government, visit the Muhafaza and sit in the office of the Muhafiz in Duhok, and they say, oh yes, we need to do everything we can to help the Yazidi people. That's what we're trying to do. Is that what they did? No, they started the blockade. And the blockade is the next serious abusive measure and the next major violation of human rights. The blockade was a strategy employed by the secret police, by the Asaish, at Suhaila checkpoint. It was designed to prevent Yazidis from returning to Shingal and prevent them from rebuilding their homes and prevent the revitalization of the economy in Shingal. And they did this for more than one reason. They did it because they had political rivals in Shingal. It's not really the fault of the Yazidi people, right? It's not justifiable to prevent Yazidi IDPs from going home just because there's a new political rival that you don't like. The international community had a responsibility to point that out, did they? Another reason was that when you have a massive IDP population inside the camps in Duhok, it creates this massive NGO industry that brings millions of dollars each month into the Kurdish economy. So there was an incentive to maintain the conditions of a displacement crisis. There was no incentive to help people go home. How did this blockade be implemented? How was it conducted? Well, I was in Shingal trying to help people return at that time. I was meeting with farmers and asking them, what do you need? What kind of supplies can we help bring you? And they said, well, we can't even bring our own supplies. At the Suhaila checkpoint, KDP are not allowing us to bring seeds to plant crops. We can't bring irrigation pipes. We can't bring wellheads to pump water out of the ground to water our crops. We can't bring fertilizer. We can't bring tractor parts. We can't bring motor oil for our harvesters. We can't bring veterinary medicine for our animals. And people in Shingal depend on animals. They depend on sheep and goats and donkeys and other animals. The people were being starved deliberately by the international community. Sorry, by the KDP, which was supported by the international community. Even medicine wasn't allowed into Shingal during that time, except in certain circumstances, by certain entities. Are you starting to see why the KDP is not a partner in the solution to this genocide? Are you seeing why the KDP can never be a partner in the solution. It's because the KDP has done more than ISIS to jeopardize the long-term survival of Yazidis in their homeland. Now that sounds like a controversial statement, but let's think about it for a moment. Yes, the ISIS wanted to annihilate all the Yazidis, and that was even worse than what the KDP has done. But they failed. They killed several thousand Yazidis and enslaved several thousand Yazidis, and the majority of the Yazidi people, they lived, they survived. So, naturally, they should be helped to go home and rebuild their lives. But then they're kept trapped in camps like prisoners year after year after year. And this exacerbated the migration crisis of Yazidis who needed to leave the country and come here to Germany and other countries because they had no hope in Iraq. And they were being targeted by violence of the Asaish in the camps. The Asaish were terrorizing Yazidis in the camps the same way that they did in Shingal before the genocide took place. Any Yazidi in the camp who opened his mouth to complain about these conditions or criticize the government for policies like the blockade, he would be targeted with terror. I interviewed a family of a journalist. Masked Asaish agents, black masks, entered their tent in the camp in the middle of the night. Their son was so traumatized, he started vomiting. He had to go to the hospital, and he was never normal after that because they looked like ISIS jihadists. These are people who survived a genocide, and they're in camps. And then the people that claim to the international community that they are protecting them, they are terrorizing them. And it destroys people's lives. And it makes people unsafe. And there are people now in Germany facing deportation back to that situation, back to that country, supposedly a safe place for them to be. It is not a safe place to be when you can't open your mouth and talk freely about the violence that has been done to you without risking your own well-being, your own physical safety, the integrity of your children's lives. That's not safe. When in history did anyone demand that genocide survivors go back to the site where the genocide occurred and live under the governance of co-perpetrators in that genocide? Were Holocaust survivors ever told, you need to move back to Poland, you need to move back to Austria, you have to go there, it's the only place for you? Did that happen? No, of course not. And it shouldn't be happening now. Now we need to talk a little bit about this NGO industrial complex that exploits this dynamic. This blockade that I've described, I exposed it in 2016 when not a single journalist was aware of it. And I was working between Dohuk and Shingal every month, going to Shingal, seeing what was happening, hearing people explain the measures directly as the blockade was evolving. So I went to the heads of the big NGOs in Dohuk because they're people committed to human rights, correct? They're Norwegians and Germans and Swiss and British and Americans and Canadians and French people. Oh, they come there and they want to help human rights, right? So for sure they're going to be outraged and they're going to stand together with us to condemn this and push back and stop it, right? No, that's not what happened. No one would stand with us and no one would open their mouth. They were cowards. And they loved to hide behind a certain expression. Well, that's not our mandate. Advocacy is not our mandate. We're here to deliver aid and humanitarian. We're not here to get into politics. Well, I'm sorry, that's wrong. Basic moral action is the mandate of every human being. If you consider yourself someone who cares about humanity and you care about human rights, then you have a mandate to stand up and speak against injustice like this that was happening. So I exposed this at great cost to myself. We were a small NGO. Strong international NGOs, they could have raised their voices with security, it would have intimidated the KRG. The KRG didn't want to upset them. They were very happy about the money flowing in. And the big NGOs were telling us, well, you shouldn't talk about this because you'll jeopardize your humanitarian work. You're just a little NGO. And I said, yeah, but if you're not willing to help us speak about this, then you leave us no choice, because our purpose, our reason for existing is not to keep these camps existing forever. It's to help people go back to Shingal so that the Yazidi people can retain possession of their historic homeland and continue to survive in their country. And if that's being jeopardized and no one knows about it and you're not willing to help us talk about it, then we will talk about it on our own. We will talk about it alone. And that was dangerous, and we suffered because of that policy. I think that the important thing to understand about NGOs is they are full of good people who want to help, and they care about people on the ground. But the entire system is not designed to confront these kinds of abuses. It's actually designed to maintain a certain status quo. And this is what's really tragic. Nobody working in the NGO environment, foreigners that is, I'm talking about the internationals who come and work there, they have no incentive to help resolve a displacement crisis. That actually works against their job security. If everybody goes home to Shingal and there's no more camps, well, that's the end of the economic livelihood of a whole lot of people whose jobs are based on this crisis situation continuing. Now, I'm not accusing the people in the NGOs of wanting that to happen consciously. I'm not accusing them of working to perpetuate this crisis. What I'm saying is that human psychology is influenced by incentives. And when there's no incentive to promote a certain course of action, but there's actually a disincentive for it, that can't but help inform the action that people end up pursuing. And you just see this. You just see the fact that the UN agencies, UN OCHA, these massive, rich INGOs, they just continue to say, well, we don't do advocacy. I'm sure some of them have, behind closed doors, expressed concerns. I mean, there's some good people there. But in general, the way the system works, it supports and maintains a status quo. Now, sadly, that makes it culpable in the genocide as well. Because if Daesh failed to eliminate the Yazidi people, but then it's the KDP that perpetuates the genocide conditions by preventing people from going home, and it's the international community and the NGO industrial complex that supports that status quo. They partner with the abuser, they partner with the KDP, and they help perpetuate this dynamic. That makes them culpable. I don't really care if it's what they want to do or not. I don't really care if it's a conscious decision or not. They are somehow supporting the delay in healing and recovery and rebuilding that must follow this genocide. We should have been helping people rebuild in 2015. Some of us did. International community did not have an interest in that. So when you treat the KRG as a partner, and I'm speaking to the international community and Western governments, all of whom deal with the KRG as a partner in addressing the Yazidi issue. They treat them as more of a partner than they treat the Yazidi community in addressing the Yazidi issue. And when you treat the KRG as a partner, you're supporting this. You're supporting the abuse. And this is what happened with the Sinjar agreement that Janine Hennis-Plashert of UNAMI spearheaded behind closed doors without informing the Yazidi community, that she negotiated between Baghdad and the KRG. How? This is unconscionable. The people who have been targeted with genocide and then abused thereafter, they're not part of this agreement. But the KRG is a co-perpetrator in the genocide? So there was no consultation with the Yazidi community, or if there was with any Yazidi figure, it was never made public. So no one could weigh in on this or discuss it. And the problem with the Sinjar Agreement, it explicitly opens the door for the KDP to resume administrative influence in Shingal. Yes, it says that all militias must leave, and that includes the Peshmerga because they're a militia. It says different things, but it clearly states that the KRG has a role in selecting administrative officials in the future of Shingal. So they negotiated this agreement with an abuser, and they're allowing abuser to return. Western officials don't understand how the KDP works. There's no middle ground with the KDP. There's no power sharing. As soon as the KDP has a foot in the door, it employs an entire system and strategy of effort to end up encroaching on that territory and taking over it, one, by installing party loyalists in certain positions, converting institutions and offices and bureaucracies to KDP loyalism. They will never stop. That's how they work. That's a strategy they have developed over many decades. The first the Yazidi people heard of the Shingal Agreement was from a Kurdish minister who is a high-ranking KDP official. There is this problem, a cultural problem in Iraq that a lot of Iraqi women's groups over the years have tried to address. It's a situation that occurs sometimes when a woman is raped, and how certain families deal with that problem and try to resolve the honor crisis that results from it is sometimes they force that man to marry the woman. Well, if they force that man to marry the woman, they're forcing the woman to marry the man. They're forcing a victim to marry her rapist. This happens a lot. It's been a common practice in Iraqi history and culture, and many modern women's groups and on the Arab side and the Kurdish side, they have worked to confront this problem. Now, when the Western countries and UNAMI create this Sinjar Agreement, and the US supports it, and they try to force the Yazidi people and the KDP together, this is analogous to forcing a victim to marry her rapist. It's really sick, and it's wrong. And we know the US played a big role in pushing the Sinjar Agreement, and the US also has guilt in the Yazidi genocide. We talked about ISIS being the #1 actor, the KDP being the #2. Turkey was probably the #3 because Turkey gave direct support for ISIS jihadists. And we had support also coming from the Gulf countries that was being sent to Salafi jihadists. But after those actors, the US bears some responsibility as well, because the US knew the genocide was coming. And they stood by and allowed ISIS to expand throughout the Arab parts of Iraq, through Anbar, through Tikrit, Salahuddin, Nineveh. They wanted ISIS to grow, to put pressure on Maliki so that he would step down and allow elections to take place, because they were afraid that the fledgling democratic norms in Iraq were being eroded and might be lost, and Maliki might turn into another despot like Saddam. So what was the cost? What was the price for that policy? Well, it was allowing a genocide to begin. Now, you can ask yourselves whether that was worth it. To preserve democratic norms, allowing a genocide against a marginalized community to take place. Now, the US knew that the genocide was happening, but they didn't order airstrikes when Iraqi officials were begging them to. Joe Biden, as vice president at that time, was receiving those calls from Iraqi ministers, and he was not allowing the airstrikes to happen. Airstrikes finally happened, which did save a lot of Yazidi people after the genocide began, but then Kocho was surrounded. And Yazidis in America, they were already connected to the White House by that time. They were in Washington having meetings at every level, Department of Defense, State Department, and the White House, begging for action. 12 days. 12 days, no action taken to defend Kocho. The Kocho massacre happened. Okay, 2 mistakes, but there's always a chance to do the right thing, right? So the next issue was there was an opportunity to rescue women and girls that were still being held around the mountain. it's sick to think about, but when you enslave several thousand people, that requires a major infrastructural, a set of procedures. You have to have a big framework to transport people out of the area. And there were hundreds of women and girls still in the Shingal and Tel Afar areas that had not yet been taken into Mosul or Raqqa, and we knew exactly where they were. And the Yazidis I was working with and myself, we were drafting reports on exactly where these locations were that people were being held, how many people were there, how many women and girls were in each place, and how many jihadists were guarding them. There was such opportunity to prevent hundreds of women from going into this rape and enslavement system that became hell for so many. And that opportunity existed for several months. And we begged for months. And we couldn't understand why no action was taking place. Because in many of the cases, there were not many jihadists guarding the women. The women were telling us by phone, oh, there's only 4 people, there's only 4 men guarding us, and there's 60 women here, for example. Sometimes when an airstrike happens, they run for cover, and a few women run away, and they've escaped to Shingal Mountain on their own without even any support. So if America had sent several helicopters with special forces just to do some rescue operations, which we were begging for, they could have saved hundreds. We couldn't understand why they weren't acting. And then in October, I sat in the White House as part of the delegation that included Babashir and several tribal leaders and other members of the Majlis Rouhani who came to America to talk about the situation. And we all sat there together. We had a week of meetings in Washington with the State Department. We conveyed our reports to every office that would listen, to the Department of Defense, to intelligence agencies, to people on Capitol Hill. And at the end, we met with the White House itself. And in every meeting, we begged, please take action now to save these girls, because the window of opportunity is closing. Every day, they're transporting more and more of them into Mosul, into Fallujah, into Syria. The window will be closed soon if you don't act. And they didn't act. And the window was closed in November. And the month after that, in December, there was an operation to take the north side of Shingal Mountain. And the Peshmerga came back through Rabia. How is that possible? I still don't understand that to this day. No U.S. official has sat down with me and looked me in the eye and gave me an explanation that convinces me how they can justify, how they could have justified at that time their non-action in one of the most horrific forms of violence I've ever encountered in my whole life. So we have a problem with the U.S. track record. It bears responsibility, and it has failed its responsibility. After all of that, what were the key Yazidi demands from the beginning that it asked the international community to take action on? It asked for 3 things. The community asked for international protection, an American base or a UN base to be in the area to preclude the opportunity for any future mobilization of a jihadist force that might conduct a genocide. And we can say that ISIS has been destroyed, but ISIS is already rebuilding right now, because we've seen reports on this from analysts talking about a resurgence of ISIS organizational capacity underway in Syria. Now, yes, the Western countries are active in thwarting this, but we know this threat will not disappear. It will return. And if you can have a UN mission like UNIFIL in the border between Lebanon and Israeli-controlled territory, why couldn't you have a UN mission on Shingal Mountain as well? I don't understand why this hasn't been discussed for a decade. Now, the second thing Yazidis demanded was a local, nonpartisan security force managed by Yazidis themselves, not managed by an external political party that cuts and runs when danger rears its head. Yazidis have asked for support and training from foreign entities from the US government and other European governments to make sure that they can defend themselves in the future, because they can't rely on anyone else to defend them. And the US said that they would pursue something like that when we met with them in 2014. And then they never did. They never pursued it. They don't seem to ever be interested in helping the Yazidis create a non-partisan force. They only want to support a force if it's linked to the Peshmerga, if it's linked to the KDP. They just keep insisting on forcing the Yazidis to work with that abuser. And the third thing was Yazidis wanted non-partisan administration. And this is really maybe the most important of the three, because you need a restabilization, you need administration to return in order to help open the doors for reconstruction, for permission and access to Shingal so that NGOs can work there. Until today, this doesn't exist. It's a decade, and no Western country has wanted to get involved and actually solve this problem. Now, what I said a number of years ago was that we need an international commission for the resolution of the Sinjar crisis, something to that effect. An international commission for the resolution of the status of Sinjar. That's what I called it. And the idea was that international governments around the world, they would make an agreement with Baghdad, probably led by the US. The UN could do this, but look how slow the UN is with everything. Oh, man. If the US would pursue this, have an agreement with Baghdad that allowed a direct role in working on the Sinjar situation, then they could develop a strategy to normalize governance there, probably create a muhafaza out of Shingal. That's something I talked about for, the last decade. And this was really needed at the beginning. We needed this action years ago. Now there are militias that are so entrenched in Shingal, more than one of them. They will be less cooperative about those kinds of changes in the future, and it will be difficult to solve this problem without some type of conflict. In 2015, 16, 17, those were good years to work on this. Now it's going to be more difficult because of the non-action. So now we don't have a Qaimakam for 10 years. We don't have a district head for Shingal for 10 years. And now that Baghdad is fully in control of Shingal, it's not as bad as it was with the KDP, but we're starting to see other problems. We're starting to see blockade-like policies, a lot of access being blocked to foreigners who want to come work with Yazidis and help them, a lot of access being blocked for NGO work. And not only that, blockage of services. So I heard that the German government, they designated like €500 million. I don't know the exact number, but hundreds of millions of euros designated for education in Shingal. I was just in Shingal at the beginning of this month. There are schools not even functioning because they can't pay for a single teacher. There are schools that serve tiny villages where you have 50 or 60 children. They only need 2 teachers to get the school running. And the school's not running because they can't pay for 2 teachers. The government isn't paying. So the Department of Education in Mosul doesn't funnel enough funds into Shingal to hire these teachers, and there's no NGO there to pick up the slack in the absence of government competence. And now last year, 2023, Baghdad passed this new general budgetary law that allocates only 2% of the budget that's reserved for governorates. Only 2% of its resources are designated for minorities. So it means that in an area, a district where perhaps the minority is the majority, like a Yazidi area, they don't have hardly any of the funding or the new employee hires that are required to support the needs in that area. People in Iraq are calling it a racist law, a racist policy, and it's a 3-year budget, 2023, 24, and 25. It's directly impacting education in Shingal. And if there's no education available for children, families won't want to move back there. So you can't say that the place is viable for people yet. I want it to be viable. I want people to live there rather than migrating to Europe. But you, Western governments, have completely and utterly failed to pursue the policies of resolution of governance and administration and security in Shingal that have been being demanded consistently for 10 years so that life can resume and then people can go home and build a life there again. I hope that officials will listen to this talk and not just stop by an exhibition and pay their respects for 5 minutes to say, hi, yeah, we support the Yazidis. No, I hope you listened to this entire talk to get an idea of just the tip of the iceberg of what the problems are, because this is just the beginning. I would need a month to sit down and talk about every form of abuse that occurs there and all of the problems that have taken place. But these are some of the crucial issues. The Sinjar Agreement, it forces a woman to marry her rapist. It needs to be discarded. I'm sorry, I know it's an extreme analogy. I'm not embarrassed to use it. This is really a sick and broken policy objective. It is time now to think about an international commission or start some kind of project in conjunction with Baghdad that gives Western governments real access to help design a framework, a long-term security and administrative framework for Shingal that works, that keeps it safe, and that defends against future genocide. Thank you very much.
To say, actually, you need